The in-game Football Manager experience is fantastic. It's always addicting to see your players play well.
Promising for a moment. Oh, brilliant! That is brilliant!
But we sometimes forget about the backroom experience, which can also be fantastic. And honestly, there's no better feeling than making a bunch of easy money from your loan army. Now, if you're an ignorant American like me, you probably don't know anything about loans. In fact, we Americans have basically no idea how anything in the world of loans works. And that's kind of ironic since we do know about horribly complex things like waivers. Interestingly enough, loans in association football go back as far as the sport itself. For example, in 1885, Blackburn apparently tried to bring in 3 players on loan to play in an FA Cup match, but were not allowed to use the players when the plan was discovered. The fascinating thing is that this was 3 years before the Football League was even formed and is before professionalism was widely accepted in the sport. Now, the idea behind loans is actually pretty easy to understand. So you've got a player under contract to play for one club, but for whatever reason, that player is not guaranteed to get playing time with that club. So the club then loans that player out to a club in a lower league, a club that can guarantee playing time for that player. I guess it's sort of like borrowing a book from the library. There was apparently a general ban on player loans by the Football Association sometime in April 1898, though I haven't found very good evidence of it. In February 1901, Middlesbrough tried to loan goalkeeper James Saunders from Glossop North End and received a stern warning from the authorities for trying to do so. But of course, that loan seems odd in hindsight since Glossop and Middlesbrough were both in the second division, and Middlesbrough was actually higher up in the table at that time. If you try to use reason and logic to figure out some of these loans, you're only going to become frustrated. Now, if you're an American like me, you might be surprised to learn that American baseball also had its own loan system during this period. Well, Connie Mack, the longtime owner and manager of baseball's Philadelphia Athletics, was famous for his loan system, and Shoeless Joe Jackson was probably his most famous loaned player. You see, in those days, there were no so-called farm systems. Major league teams had to make their own arrangements for each player they had under contract who needed to develop in lower level leagues. And so when Joe Jackson stayed in the lower levels despite having a Philadelphia contract in 1909, he was actually on loan. All of that left North American sports by the time the 1930s or so rolled around, and in association football in the UK, loans were officially against the rules up until the Second World War when they made a surprising return. We tend to forget this, but the league in England split into numerous regional leagues during World War II starting in 1939. The lack of players led to the creation of a guest player system. This was basically a loan system that worked for individual matches. And so, for example, Stan Mortensen of Blackpool fame wound up playing for Arsenal in 1944, and it apparently happened more than once. Actually, Mortensen was pretty unusual when it came to his team loyalties. During a September 1943 England-Wales match, Mortensen suited up as an England reserve but then made his international debut for Wales because of a Welsh injury. Mortensen wound up scoring twice for Wales in that match. England won 8-3, but Mortensen made history regardless. After the war was over, however, the loan system was scrapped once again in England, and it didn't really come back until 1966. Like everything else in sport in those days, there was a strong conservative backlash against the system, which the newspapers called temporary transfers. The original rules prohibited transfer fees, they allowed clubs only 2 loans in a season, and they specified that clubs could not loan players to teams in the same division. Over time, of course, those rules were liberalized until we got to our current system. Chelsea, of course, are probably the most notorious for loaning out players. They had 42 players loaned out back in the 2018-19 season. But these days, their loanee numbers look a little bit more reasonable. But that's the real world. What we care about here, of course, is the Football Manager world. So let's take a look at how the loan system in Football Manager works. The easiest way to find players to loan in is to go to your player search screen. Look at players interested in a loan with your club. Look at players listed for loan, and now you can sort by the highest value to find potential good deals. So here is Paul Tart, who Arsenal have offered out on loan, and then we can make an offer. Change this offer over to loan offer since I'm not going to pay $228 million for him. And here it tells you what Arsenal wants: an 80% playing wage contribution, a 100% unused wage contribution, and the monthly fees. And then there's this part here, the optional future fee. What that optional future fee means is that I can optionally pay $300 million for that player at the end of his loan to bring him on permanently. Now, sometimes you can get that to get your wage contribution for a loan player to come down. So in this case, the loan doesn't make any sense. I mean, I can buy him out right now for less than the optional future fee, and I could probably negotiate the $228 million down if I really wanted to. Of course, as they say on the official forums, you really need to pay attention, especially if they give you a mandatory future fee. Anyway, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm really not a huge fan of loaning players in. It works really well if you've got a lower league side, but I've never really seen the point of it once you've got some real money kicking around at your club. Loaning players out, however, is entirely different. Okay, as you can see in this old youth academy save of mine, I've got a B team with far too many players. I've also got a really large under-19 squad. Those are the ideal conditions for a loan army. You want to develop your club until it's at least somewhat wealthy and until you've got a ton of players that are just sitting around. Once you've got the right circumstances, you can then figure out who you want to loan out and who you want to keep at the club. Now, the first thing I recommend doing is making a list of players you want on your squad at all levels. Start with your first team and go through position by position. Ideally, you want 2 players at each position at each level, a starter and a backup. Now, if both players on your first team squad at that position are injured, you want to have 2 good players on your B squad to choose from if at all possible. And the same goes for your youth team. The idea here is to create a kind of player development machine. Players should naturally progress from the youth team to the B team and should then be able to fit into spots that are open on the first team after other players leave or get injured or whatever. Now, the reality is that you're going to run into players who are older and just aren't good enough. Ideally, you want to sell those players. Of course, a lot of those players are not going to sell. You could try to loan out the older players, but you want to be careful. Make sure that you understand the competition rules first. So in this version of the World Super League, clubs are limited to having 100 players out on loan at a time. In other words, I probably should think twice before I let a worthless 28-year-old player take up one of our loan slots. Now that brings up the next question: what kind of players can you loan out for money? Okay, what you're probably looking for is a setup like this one. This comes from a pretty famous Reddit post from way back in 2017. This Redditor wrote out a pretty complex system to figure out how much to ask for. In those days, the rule of thumb was that teams would be willing to pay 25% of the player's value per month. Now, I went through a few years ago and simplified the math a little bit in my own post. Of course, it's going to be easier if I just show you how the math works, so let's take a look. Okay, let's look at this guy, Mugarel Grigori, for example. He's got a transfer value of about 1.1 million. I always take the low end when making these calculations. Now we take that 1.1 million and divide it by 192. That gives us $5,729. That is the amount per week that the computer will theoretically pay for him. Now, when we offer him out to other clubs, we can see that his wages are over $23,000 per week. So we will need to ask for a percentage of that, in that case about 20%. Of course, the calculation will be different depending on how good the player actually is. So if I were crazy and wanted to loan out Enric, my star striker, the calculation would be a lot different. The low end of Enric's value is $209 million. 209 million divided by 192 is a little bit over $1,088,500. Now his wages are at $67,000 per week. We could theoretically ask for something like $4 million per month, since the AI would theoretically be willing to pay that much for a player of this caliber. But on the other hand, you want to be careful before you just jump into something like that. After all, your team still needs to play games, right? Now, if you're looking for a really good way to identify bargain players, I recommend checking out this player attribute calculator. It's free and it allows you to see who on your squad is of high quality and who isn't. And this calculator uses FM Arena's attribute testing as the basis for the numbers that it finds out. And so if you've got the time, you can run your massive squads through that calculator at the start of every season to figure out which players are likely to improve and to figure out which ones might be overvalued by the in-game valuation system. The idea then is to loan out the players who are overvalued and hold on to the players who are good and can still develop. Anyway, in the end, it's not hard to get a massive loan army set up. And as you can see, I'm making quite a bit of money in loan fees alone. Some of these players, like Darren McQueen, might wind up making me a bunch of money on loan and then might wind up sold for even more money. By using this system, you can make money off of players you really don't want to keep on your squad and then make even more money by selling them outright once they're too old to hang around. Now, it's not quite as easy in FM24 as it was in earlier versions of FM, so keep that in mind. And the computer will not necessarily make you the offer that you think it should for your players. That rule of 192 is really not a hard and fast rule. It's just sort of a guideline by which you can look at these things. Now, if you mess around with it a little bit, you will find eventually that it becomes pretty easy to create a massive loan army, and eventually you'll end up earning a lot of money in loan fees just because you happen to own the rights to a bunch of players. And then when no one wants to loan them out anymore, you just sell them off.